The world of Utopia is far from utopian. Spanning 2 series and 12 episodes, the story follows several diverse individuals who are united when they come into possession of the sequel to a cult graphic novel. They soon find themselves entangled in a world-changing conspiracy and hunted by a ruthless organisation called the Network. Its incredibly unique style and shocking violence made it unlike anything else on TV, yet despite its critical acclaim, this uniqueness probably has something to do with its declining viewership and ultimate cancellation. But are the visuals of Utopia merely superficial, and is the violence simply gratuitous? I'd say no, they're not. Utopia undeniably stands out in its presentation, but what creates this effect?
The first series is coloured according to a Technicolor palette from the sort of 1940s and 50s. It's got a yellow, cyan, magenta colour palette as opposed to red, green and blue. It's the opposite of what you'd normally expect.
You don't have to look hard to see how the Technicolor films of early Hollywood influenced the look of Utopia. In light of these films, the aesthetic suggests a cheerful American and optimistic outlook, which is at odds with the theme of the show, yet fitting in the hopes for a future Utopia. But the colour isn't the only apparent influence of classical filmmaking. While the rule of thirds is employed traditionally, it is often exploited through the centre framing of subjects, with an emphasis on visual symmetry and converging lines. In classical Hollywood films, symmetry was often achieved by centering actors in shot. This one-point perspective is reminiscent of Kubrick's use of wide-angle lenses, as well as the symmetry of Wes Anderson. The opening episode of Series 2 even uses the 4:3 Academy ratio to reflect the time in which it's set, including genuine news footage, further highlighting its attention to form. These fundamental guidelines of composition, on their most basic level, create a visually pleasing effect for the viewer, and Utopia's strong avoidance then contributes to its distinctly cinematic style. So this implicitly modern aesthetic is in fact built upon the foundations of classical composition. So we know why Utopia definitely looks so, frankly, cool. But is there reasoning behind these stylistic choices? The juxtaposition between naturalistic settings and their striking saturation makes Utopia seem hyper-real in its presentation, at once familiar and surreal. In fact, the indistinct line between reality and fantasy is surely alluded to by the inclusion of characters called Alice, Mr. Rabbit, Jessica and Peter, as they fall down a deadly rabbit hole. This hyper-reality gives it a style which wouldn't look out of place in a comic book, further emphasised by the often static camera. This could be seen as self-referential, and that it's a graphic novel which drives the narrative. These recurring shots, often used to open the episodes, are also significant. The saturated greens, purples and yellows are acidic in nature, and while they again create a surreal aesthetic, they attain a greater significance in retrospect.
It was a protein that we bred into foodstuffs, okay? A modification of corn.
The network's plot to contaminate the crops ties into the contemporary issue of GM food, and the scarcity of food which is crucial to the plot, while the seemingly natural agricultural landscape is turned into something far more sinister. See also, any food in the series. This acidic yellow is predominantly associated with the network, and it crops up more subtly at moments of narrative shift. To explore this idea further, let's look at one of the most interesting characters, Wilson. The initially rightly paranoid conspiracy theorist, who lives entirely off the grid and even has a fallout shelter in the garden, evolves in a drastic way as signposted by the mise-en-scène surrounding him. The duo of Arby and Lee is subverted through colour in the second series, with Wilson symbolically taking on Lee's previous secondary role.
Are you Wilson? Well, why aren't you wearing blue?
Don't look good in blue.
The clothing mise-en-scène keeps up this emblematic hierarchy, with the character of Leia temporarily acting as the network's head being defined by her redness, a newly introduced colour to the show's palette. The colours begin to merge from blues and greens, through to the network's yellow in this turning point in his allegiance. Then red slowly creeps in until he's ultimately in power and turns to the dark side. Then by the end of the series we see this striking shot. As the most dramatic character development, it also highlights the violence and bloodshed he's responsible for, and the harshness of the colour suggests an inability of redemption at this point. Utopia can then be encapsulated by the smiling yellow bag synonymous with the show, hiding something much darker behind the bright outward surface. There's a discrepancy between the colourful settings and the brutal acts which occur in them, making even seemingly safe or domestic settings potentially deadly. Which brings us on to... The violence of Utopia is undoubtedly brutal, so much so that it inevitably caught the attention of certain tabloids. But is it justified? Writer Dennis Kelly had this to say: "The only violence I find personally offensive is violence that doesn't shock you. Every time I see violence in real life, it has always been shocking." This idea also ties into theorists such as James Kendrick, who believe that violence on screen is least enjoyable when it's taken seriously. In contrast to its colour palette, the kind of violence in Utopia isn't characterised by over-stylization. There's no build-up after an epic showdown, no sweeping camera angles, and no slow-mo bullet time. Instead, the violence is immediate, sudden, and ruthless. It is deliberately shocking in its presentation, rather than being entertaining in the sense of providing spectacle. That alone doesn't exempt it from being gratuitous. The series depicts several murders even in its opening moments, one of those implicitly being a child. The stakes are immediately raised, in the sense that no one is safe from violence, meaning there's the constant suggestion of potential future violence pervading the series. And although such actions seem unjustifiable, the violence in Utopia is steeped in moral ambiguity.
Don't put the gas away yet.
2050, that's when fish stocks run out. Do you fucking get that?
Of course, you told me.
2080, end of gas. 2090, end of oil. Those figures don't come from Greenpeace or Friends of the fucking Earth. They come from BP. But what we must do puts us beyond morality.
The network fully believes that everything they do is for the greater good of humanity. This moral ambiguity, framed by a real-world concern, blurs the divide between the main characters who try to maintain short-term peace without violence, and the network who justify themselves by looking to the future. While the network's power and violence is defined by its efficiency, and characters either being devoted to their greater good or brainwashed to feel no empathy, the effects it has on normal people are not overlooked. As you can see, childhood and innocence are strongly tied into the issue of violence. The experiments performed on Arby as a child actually help us sympathise with the cold killer, alluding to the way in which violence begets violence. It's also worth bringing up certain imagery. Milner is characterised as the devil in the reveal of her betrayal in this shot, while Ian stops a deadly virus being unleashed by killing. Here he is ironically presented as angelic, while he spent the rest of the series avoiding killing. Yet this shot represents all those he saved in the short term. These images are rife with symbolism. Both characters kill, but to different ends, yet it is Ian's value of individual life which seems to make him saintly. Milner justifies killing billions for the sake of the future, Wilson can justify thousands, whereas Ian struggles with one killing.
I'm like you now.
You are not like me.
Stop saying that I am!
Grant views violence as empowering, seeing Arby as a father figure to replace the one he never had, yet he is ultimately still a normal child. So there are consequences as a result of violence and different degrees of rationale, thereby avoiding making it superfluous or normalised. Despite its on-screen brutality, violence is often suggested rather than shown, such as the controversial school shooting scene, with the lack of on-screen killing in turn making it more disturbing. The act again highlights Arby's indoctrination and the extremity of the network in creating a scenario so horrific that it can be used to frame Grant, while the very darkly comical mise-en-scène further highlights the horror through its absurdity, something which isn't uncommon throughout the show.
Well, we could say suicide, but it'll be a bit of a stretch.
Another example of implied violence is the eye-watering torture scene in the first episode, which brings us back to Wilson. In the eyes of the network, violence is only implemented when necessary. Aside from Alice, Wilson is the only character to kill out of revenge.
There's no reason to kill me, and we both know you need a reason.
Although the network tortured him and killed his father, unlike Alice, Wilson firmly believes in their ideology. But the moment he kills Lee, out of revenge rather than necessity, shows the culmination of Wilson's transformation into something perhaps even more ruthless than Milner. The visuals and violence of Utopia are defined by opposition. Its carefully framed composition is at odds with a world destined for chaos, the saturated colours contrast with the brutal violence, and there are two distinct sides of a huge ethical dilemma. Yet within these oppositions, characters are shown to transgress, whether killing out of integrity or necessity, children losing their innocence, or characters switching sides completely. While it certainly isn't for everyone, Utopia is not simply an example of style over substance, nor is the violence overtly gratuitous.
Ian, you won't be able to shoot me.
Yeah? Don't imagine I won't, Jess.
No, really, you won't be able to shoot me. You've got the safety catch on. They don't generally have safety catches, except on telly.